So I don't know if any of you ever do this, but sometimes I like to imagine if I'm ever in the position, maybe one day, to own a vacation home, I try to figure out if I would rather have one at the beach or one in the mountains. Just curious, take a poll. How many of you would rather have a vacation home at the beach? How many of you would rather have one in the mountains? See, it's about evenly split. This is the dilemma that I have. Both are really appealing, right? But for very different reasons. There are both places to relax and unwind and retreat from the world, but in very different ways. And here's my thinking. Here's why I have this dilemma. To me, the beach is the place I go to do nothing, right? It's where I go to just sit in the sun on the beach, to soak up, the rays, to listen to the waves, to eat endless snacks, and really just nap whenever I need to. It's where I like to go to generally do as little as possible. That is the beach. That's appealing. But the mountains are different too, and they're beautiful in a different way. For me, they are a place of more active leisure. Oftentimes when David and I travel, we like to go for a hike. The mountains make me want to hike and be out in nature or to ski, depending on the season. I want to go out and camp and build fires and have adventures and then come back to the house to rest or probably do laundry and shower eventually. So in my head, trying to decide between these two, one day when I win the lottery, vacation homes, is like trying to decide whether my ideal state in the world is just passively going with the flow, right? That's the beach, just passively going with the flow, eating when I'm hungry, sleeping when I'm tired, and just doing nothing. Or is my ideal state of being to be more actively engaged with my environment, to be out in it and enjoying it in a different way? Now, I admit trying to decide where I will build my proverbial dream house isn't a perfect way to think about and understand Jesus' parable of these two builders, right? That comes at this very end of the Sermon on the Mount. But that's just what came to my mind this week when I was reflecting on this passage of these two builders. Because this is how Jesus concludes this large, extended teaching called the Sermon on the Mount that we have been working through these past several weeks. And the reason that came to mind, this dilemma that I'm constantly trying to figure out that probably will never happen, but still I would like to have an answer if it does, is that we are always faced with this choice. We are always given a choice, figuratively speaking, about how and where we want to live, how we want to be oriented to the world. We're given this choice that we can wisely construct shelters that will withstand the storms of life, or we can foolishly invest in structures that will be washed away in the first rainy season. And before we get too far into this idea of home building, I am curious, on this last week of looking at the Sermon on the Mount, do you know what I'm going to ask? Yeah, you all know. How many of you took the time in the past 4 weeks to read through the entire Sermon on the Mount? Okay, all right, we got a few gold stars. You can still do it. This is not your last opportunity. And I encourage you to read through the whole thing, not only because we didn't have time to cover it all. It's really only 3 chapters, and I did the word count last night. It's only 2,400 words. That's like not quite half, double my sermon. So if I ever go over 2,400, well, I'll trim it back. It's the Sermon on the Mount. But I wanted you to read it because I wanted you to be surprised. As I told a couple of people last week, there are a lot of things in the Sermon on the Mount that will sound familiar and kind of make you go, oh, that's where that's from. You heard the saying, don't throw pearls before swine? Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Where is that? Sermon on the Mount. Don't worry, be happy. Okay, that is not in the Sermon on the Mount. That's a test. That's Bobby McFerrin, very good. But I'm pretty sure that Bobby McFerrin is paraphrasing Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount that say, don't worry about what you will eat or drink or what you will wear. Don't worry, be happy. And I think the staying power of these particular lines, and generally the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, come from its overarching theme that we have been kind of focusing on over these 4 weeks. That the Sermon on the Mount is about what it means and what it takes to live into the kingdom of heaven. Remember, this teaching was given to people who had all the cards stacked against them in society. And it shows them how to live in the world, not as the world is, but as God desires it to be. There's a difference there. Not living in the world as it is, but living in the world as God desires it to be. And if you remember again, when we first started, I suggested that this entire teaching has been an expansion of what Jesus preached in his very first and very short sermon, which you all should know by now, right? That first word, repent, right? Repent or change. One version says, change your hearts and your minds. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. And coming on the heels of that first sermon, this whole teaching has been about how to properly reorient and align ourselves with the kingdom of heaven rather than all of the kingdoms of the world. So it seems fitting that in the end of this 20 to 30 minute teaching, depending on how fast Jesus talked, he concludes by telling a story about 2 builders who each built a house but end up with very different outcomes. And the difference between them is one of perspective and foresight. Earlier in the teaching, Jesus pointed out how the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. So when the rains come in this parable, as they always do, the distinction isn't about which builder is good or evil, because rain falls on the good and the evil alike. It's not even about who is a better builder. What makes the difference is that one has the knowledge about the best place to build. One has the foresight to know that rains will come, even if it seems completely dry and stable now. What makes this one builder wise is knowing that no structure, no matter how well it is built or how strong it appears, will be able to stand for very long unless it's built on a solid foundation, one that's not at the mercy of shifting sands. So the first aspect of wisdom is to cultivate this longer range of vision, right? That's not just focused on the here and now that may be the dry season and doesn't pay attention to the rains that will come. This longer range of vision is familiar with the patterns of how empires and systems rise and fall. That trying times will always come, that the rains will always come, that temporary things will be washed away, and wisdom knows that most things of the world are temporary. And the second aspect to wisdom here is that we're to invest in what lasts, to build a life that is founded on God's desires for us. It's interesting to note that Jesus isn't talking about these builders building just anything, right? He's very specific that they are building what? They're building houses. And houses are a special class of building. Just think for a moment about what it means to build a house. Think about everything that goes into building a home, right? I think most of us would agree that a home is more than just a roof over 4 walls and a foundation. That the home is where you build your life. It's the place where you feel most safe and secure. It's where you keep everything that's most important to you. It's where you rest and retreat from the world. And we're given this choice about where we make our home, whether it's in a place where we passively go with the flow or one in which we are actively engaged in what's going on in the world. Again, earlier in the sermon, Jesus told his hearers not to store up for themselves treasures on earth. Right? He says, don't store up the kind of treasures that can be consumed by moths or destroyed by rust, or the kinds of treasures that thieves can steal. So basically, not any kind of earthly treasure. He warns his hearers to avoid getting caught up in pursuing and stockpiling these temporary and corruptible things that worldly kingdoms deem are important. Instead, Jesus shows his hearers how to pursue what's valuable in the kingdom of heaven. His teaching and his life's ministry is all about striving to be in right relationship with others, reflecting the love of God, and always being in the process of living into the kingdom of heaven. Always being in this process of reorienting ourselves to the kingdom of heaven. Because these are the things that last. These are the things that matter. These are the things that will hold you when everything else gets washed away. At the end of the teaching, Jesus' parable, this short little parable about two builders, shows us that it's not just about where we store our treasures, but that it's also about where we choose to live. It's about the foundation on which we build and base our lives. See, we may be subjects of worldly kingdoms, but Jesus shows us how to live as citizens of heaven. We live in these two worlds simultaneously, and we can feel the tension of it. We can't avoid living in the worldly kingdoms of economic and political and even religious systems. But while these worldly kingdoms are based in the pursuit of and possession of power, Jesus shows us a different way. Jesus shows us how to build a home for ourselves that won't be washed away when the systems of the world break down, as they will at some point, no matter how sturdy and strong they seem now. Being wise is about recognizing the worldly kingdoms for the shifting sands that they are, and choosing instead to build strong relationships with each other, to invest in things that bring us joy, and daring to live into God's desire for the world as it should be. See, living into God's dream for the world isn't about withdrawing from the world as it is. Rather, it's about engaging the world from this different perspective, one that knows the rains will always come, and yet builds accordingly. The wise scholar and Christian mystic Richard Rohr identifies the challenge of living into God's dream for the world in the midst of the world as it is when he writes this. He says, "Remember this, there are always two worlds. The world as it operates is power. The world as it should be is love. The world as it is will always be built on power, ego, and success. Yet we also must keep our eyes on the world as it should be." And he concludes by saying this profound statement: "Power apart from love leads to brutality. But love that does not engage with power is mere sentimentality." Orienting ourselves to the kingdom of heaven means practicing and pursuing and propagating God's love for the world. It means not being afraid to engage with power, but choosing to build our lives around what matters most. Not power or ego or success, but peace and hope and joy and love. Building our lives on what matters most is about caring for one another and actively living into God's dream for the world, rather than passively accepting the world as it is. So, beloved of God, it is never too late to build your life on what has the power to sustain you when the world becomes like shifting sand and everything gets washed away. So as we conclude this time and move into this season of Lent, I encourage you to keep reorienting yourself. Keep realigning yourself with the kingdom of heaven. And the world will never be the same. Amen.